Okay, 2 more minutes. On standby. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, and we are pleased to have with us our special guest from the Queensland University of Technology and in Australia. We have Dr. Luis Quijano. He is just a newly minted PhD, and he is a designer scientist and a Fulbright future scholar with a passion for shaping the future of sustainable fashion and materials through biotechnology. He currently holds a PhD in fashion design from Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and his work lies at the intersection of design, material innovation, and synthetic biology, developing bio-based materials and products from feedstocks such as bacterial cellulose and sea urchin waste that reduce environmental impact and reimagine fashion and materials production. So without further ado, we would like to welcome Dr. Luis Quijano to give a talk on biotechnology and transdisciplinary innovation for sustainable fashion and textiles. Welcome, Luis.
Hello, good morning. If I remember correctly, I think in Tagalog it was Mangkadang Umaga. I hope I said it correctly.
That's fine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Morning.
I will share my screen. in a moment and I'll begin the presentation then. Um, is it full screen or am I having the same issue again?
You can it's
You
the
can
full
pre
screen.
Let me just do try one more time. Display setting.
Yeah,
There we go.
that's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
So today's topic is going to be about design's living future, biotechnology, and transdisciplinary innovation for sustainability. Um, but before we begin, this is something common in Australia. And so I would like to acknowledge the land upon which I am standing on, the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Oceti Sakowin, meaning Seven Council Fires, which is the proper name for the people referred to as Sioux. I pay respect to their elders' lores, customs, and creation spirits, both past and present, and to all who have stewarded the land throughout generations. I recognize that the lands I am in currently have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. I acknowledge the important role Oceti Chacowin people play within the local community. Now, as was mentioned earlier, my name is Luis Quijano. I just finished my PhD in fashion design at Queensland University of Technology, and I just got my diploma in the mail yesterday, so that was exciting. I was fortunate to be a Fulbright scholar and get funding from Australia for the second half of my PhD, as well as a two-time International Textile Apparel Association Graduate Student Fellow awardee. And for part of my research, I went to China for 6 months in a chemistry laboratory, and I had that exchange experience. And so when I talk about my research, a lot of the work is not just in one discipline alone. I do some studies in design as well as in science and education. And so some of those studies I'll share with you today are in a mix of different disciplines. And so for today's lecture, I'm going to briefly introduce the topic, then we'll explore textiles together, as well as where is the future of fashion heading towards. And then we'll talk about the transdisciplinary collaboration. So when you combine different fields, how can you make that collaboration process smoother? And finally, we'll go over two case studies, the main one being bacterial cellulose from my PhD thesis research, as well as an emerging project that I'm a part of that is dealing with sea urchin waste. And finally, we can have the Q&A session after. So the learning objectives, first, to understand the role of biotechnology in the future of fashion. Second, to identify the trends in bio-based materials and technologies. Third, to understand how these various discipline collaborations happen for these textiles of the future, how designers, scientists, and engineers work together, and how we examine the case studies to show that design can work with STEM. Um, and so, if you would like, I encourage you all, if you have your phone or you want to use online, I have some interactive questions on the slides. And so, if you add this code on this website or scan the QR code, you can take part in it as well. If not, we can always just be more conversational. So, I see one person has signed up. Thank you. Um, I'll give a minute more just in case anyone else wants to participate in the interactive questions. Hmm. I see it's now 3. Thank you. Thank you for the thumbs up. Okay, it's 5. I'll just give it a few more seconds and then we'll move on to the next slides. Okay, so let's first explore textiles. And the question that I want to ask you first is, when we talk about creating textiles, what kind of processes are involved? Who are the stakeholders involved? So what kind of processes and who are the people, what different groups of people are involved in this? So for instance, there may be business and marketing. Can you all write some more answers down? Okay, great. So our first response, it says weavers, cotton farmers, spinners, community. The second one, material suppliers, cultivators, processors, weavers, middlemen, sellers, clients, suppliers, and workers. Right. I had the opportunity to visit the Philippines 3 years ago, and I got to see a lot of the textile weaving, and I learned there's so much heritage there with the materials and textiles. So I see some of that in the answers, cultural heritage. I'll give a little more before we move on to the next slide. Right. There's also material engineers, textile designers, and I guess you can also say the fashion designers. And so, as we can see from these answers, when we look at the beginning to the end, from like the raw material straight to the clothing sold, there are so many processes and stakeholders involved. And that also means that every one of those groups have their own knowledge and have to work together. And so, one thing we can agree upon moving forward is that fashion is currently in maybe a state of unsustainability. The current industry contributes significantly to environmental degradation, including things such as water pollution, toxic chemicals, carbon dioxide emissions, and textile waste. In particular, the synthetic textiles derived from fossil fuels now account for 69% of global textile production, and this is expected to rise to almost three quarters by the end of the decade. And so while fashion continues to expand, continues to produce more and more, it also uses more natural resources. And this environmental sustainability has become a critical issue and conversation point in our generations and future ones. And so when we take a look at the academic literature in the humanities, some people question if are we too late to change the process that we're going towards, in the sense that we significantly have altered our earth. We are producing more than maybe our planetary boundaries can handle. And so for instance here, Wark, a scholar, said, everybody knows this civilization is over, and the good news is we can all start building another one, etc. And so a lot of scholars take an approach that it's too late or it's over. However, I think that's where the biodesign, biotechnology that I will share about later can possibly come in as a fix, a potential solution using technology. However, we also have to be careful that when we incorporate technology, that it's used ethically. Otherwise, there can be inequities from the consumerism, capitalism, race, gender, and so on. And so when we use and talk about the biotechnology, it also allows us to play a more positive and important role through imagination. And so, whereas other forms of attempts have been made to reduce the consumption, it may be necessary more and more in the future to use technology. And so, when I was working on my thesis, I noticed this climate clock. If you go on the link or search it, they actually have a live countdown. And I screenshotted this on the 21st earlier this week. We have apparently less than 4 years to change that before global warming may become too late. And so now, when we see the problems of fashion production, fast fashion, let's take a look at potentially what are some solutions that we can have in biodesign and biotechnology. But first, before I give some examples and talk about biomaterials, my next question for you all is, what kinds of biomaterials have you already heard of? If you've heard of any, are you aware of any biomaterial companies around the world or even in the Philippines? Yes, the first answer, pineapple fiber. There's a lot of production in the Philippines for this. Um, any other examples that you can think of? Oh, yes, yes, the mycelium leather made from the mushroom fungi roots is growing in popularity. The vegan leather from mushrooms, right? Wait just a little longer. hmm Right, there's also bacterial cellulose and starch straws. Good. hmm And I guess the good thing is that you've already heard of some of them. They are growing in popularity as an alternative for the synthetic fibers. And so when we take a look at these biomaterials, biotextiles, we can define them as materials derived from biological sources such as agro-industrial waste feedstocks, or those produced from living organisms such as bacteria, fungi, plants, yeast, and so on. And so some of the examples you already included, such as bacterial cellulose, fungal, mushroom leather, waste byproducts, and so on. And so some particular examples are AM silk. They actually use modified spider silk threads. So they made the fabric backing of the watch and the belt and this limited edition jacket, which was a collaboration with North Face. Another company is Algae Knit, and they're based in the UK, and they make a biodegradable yarn that is made from kelp, seaweed. And finally, this company also has some work in the Philippines and Spain. They also are Pinatex, and that they take the leafy part of the pineapple and they turn it into a leather-like alternative. And so when we look at these companies that are emerging, it's actually a very fast growing market and industry. So in the last decade, more than 3 billion US dollars have been invested in these new materials. And at least in this report that was made last year from the Material Innovation Institute, they identified 144 companies, but this is fast growing. A majority are working with leather alternatives, but they're silk, wool, down, and fur. And so the largest funding from one company was more than $500 million. And so most are plant based, some are microbe derived. And so today I'll talk a little bit about both of those main categories. And so part of my research, I did a study on future fashion. And so we were looking at fashion and biotechnology are seeming to come together. So what does that mean for fashion? What futures are suggested? And we noticed that biotechnology can offer fashion as industry and culture diverse ways of knowing and forming relationships with the more than human world. And more than human, I mean that when we work with the microbes, the yeast, the organisms, or other stakeholders that are not human, they also have agency. So considering them in the design process. And so for this paper, we did a 5-year study on several different databases. And what we found is that the current state of play, what is practically happening, we can divide this in 3 areas. First, we are seeing a replacement of the existing synthetic fibers with bio-based equivalents. So, for instance, there is a company called Genomatica, and instead of making a nylon through petroleum, they're making the nylon precursor, pre-materials, using sugar fermentation. And so that allows them to be more sustainable and avoid using petroleum for that same material. In addition, what we're seeing a lot of is the new fibers, new materials, and new companies. So, apple leather, orange leather, mango leather, pineapple leather, you will find every waste product out there, maybe in food, as a potential material and a startup that is trying to develop that technology. And third, we're seeing the use of biotechnology to make more sustainable dyes. So there are bacteria, yeast, organisms out there that naturally produce color. And some startups are trying to develop that to be produced big enough to match the needs of the fashion textile dyeing. In addition, some researchers are engineering, they're adding color coding or proteins into the organism and modifying how efficiently they can produce it. And that's another area of many companies working on. And so while we look at the practical side, philosophically, culturally, we notice that fashion future has three narratives in the fashion biotechnology space. The first one was that the taming, biotechnology for a cleaner industry. It's a solution, it's more of extracting the benefit to solve a problem. Whereas rewilding is the second area, and this is about open access, do it yourself, accessible, anyone can grow their own material, anyone can use these technologies kind of mindset. So there are homegrown or maker spaces where people can share their expertise and knowledge together. And the last one is speculating. So this refers to speculative design, where you imagine or go through a series of exercises to create alternative futures. And so even though fashion is facing an unsustainable status quo, biotechnology offers a potential solution, yet there is a limited uptake of approaches. Taming is the most popular, and rewilding and speculative practices have seen less adoption. But together, all of these narratives offer the following solution where biotechnology can work with all of us, not just big companies, and for the more than human, where it can be democratized and accessible, and also a way of imagining and inventing the future. And so, taking a look at how these areas are merging together, me coming from a design background, I have to learn a lot in other areas and disciplines, and I had to take the role of breaking boundaries, as you see with the four puzzle pieces. How do you combine things together? How do you talk to others? But before I share of that experience, I have another question for you. And I wanted to ask, what areas of expertise or knowledge, what disciplines are required in fashion and textiles? So feel free to type some answers and we'll see them pop up on the screen again. Perfect. Yes, materials engineering. What else is required? Design, right? And I guess there's a lot of forms of design. Um, Design and marketing, yes, especially once the clothing or the product is made, or even when you're selling the textiles to the company, you may have to do some marketing there. What else can we think of? Tailoring, yes. So when you have the textile, you need to make it into a product and it needs to fit a good sizing for your customer and you need to make it look good. You have to consider the color choices. Oh, yes, chemistry as well. So, most of the raw materials, they need extra steps to make sure that they have the right finishes, the right chemicals in them, and you want them ideally to be sustainable. So those are extra steps to consider. Technologies, right? Mm-hmm. So these are great answers. Thank you, everyone. And so while we consider all of these areas of expertise, there's various forms of collaboration that I just wanted to briefly discuss and go over with you. As we can see in the three images, the first one on the left, this is called multidisciplinary. And this is when, okay, for instance, we have a problem solution, let's say climate change. And so biology, field A may have their own biological solutions and how they can make the world better. But maybe chemistry might have different problem approach and fashion design the same. And so they may be coordinating, sequencing, mapping of terms within academia, but they're not necessarily working together. They're just thinking on the same problem and same solution and how they can tackle it. Now, interdisciplinary, this takes things one step further in that you had the separate fields, but now they're merging together. So, for instance, what I'll share in the next slides, biodesign, this takes concepts from biology and design, and now you have a new practice, and that's biodesign can come up with some unique solutions. And so some of the action words in interdisciplinary can be integrating, interacting, linking within academia. And finally, with transdisciplinary, you have the concepts from before, but the uniqueness is that you're not just staying in academia, you're also including stakeholders. So design, policy making, management. For me, when I work with emerging materials, I often talk with the manufacturers, the startups. For my sea urchin project, I talk directly to the sea urchin divers to understand their problem and how we can provide a solution. And so I'll share more about that later. And so when we take a look at biodesign, bridging science and design, it particularly uses biological processes and organisms as tools for design, creating sustainable functional materials. And in this process, designers are no longer designing prototypes alone. They are now growing, making, co designing new materials with living organisms or byproducts. And those have more than human considerations because designers usually think more holistic and they have to consider all the stakeholders involved. And so when we take a look at biodesign, here are some areas that I work with that I kind of have to overlap. So there's the design element. What do I want to make a better future and what design methods and biology? So if you are interested in the organisms that make the material, you may go more of a biology route. Whereas for me, I'm more interested in the end material, end product, and that incorporates chemistry and material science. And so now that we have that background of the fashion industry, of the different knowledge of disciplines and how we can combine it, let's take a look at our first case study. And so bacterial cellulose is the most abundant biopolymer on Earth. And it's cellulose made from bacteria. And this bacterial cellulose can be made from a variety of mediums. So an artisanal one is kombucha SCOBY tea, as in this picture, with water, sugar, and green tea. Or in the lab, it can also be called Heston straw media. Different ingredients, but this is more sterile. But it's also more expensive. And so the model microorganism is Commagatibacter salinus. There are many bacteria, but this one just produces it the most cost effectively. And you may actually know bacterial cellulose in other words and other forms. So, for instance, I know in Southeast Asia, nata de coco is very popular for some snacks or beverages, and that is also cellulose derived. But they use coconut water fermentation to get that nata de coco. And I remember when I was visiting Philippines and living in Thailand and China, I always like to drink the beverages of nata de coco. So it's hard to find here in the US. And so when we take a look at the bacterial cellulose, I want to show you this video the laboratory did of the microbes in action. And so here you can actually see under magnification, these are the Commagatibacter salinus, and these small thin lines are the cellulose that it's extruding out of its body. And it's a byproduct. And some groups are trying to make these sporadic, the lines that are everywhere, they're trying to make them uniform to make a stronger material, but that's still in development. And so in the next paper I'll share, I analyzed 198 academic papers using alternative ingredients for bacterial cellulose production. And in this paper, particularly, I was looking at the people, the patterns, disciplines, and what I found was that in that data set, there was 62 disciplines identified, and not just in the sciences, also in the social science. So for here, you can see economics and econometrics, and medicine, polymer plastics, biotechnology, and so on. So this shows you that even with the same material, there are so many different ways and perspectives that can help bring it together, develop it further. I also noticed in that data set that this type of using waste byproduct to grow the material is rising, and those publications more than doubled. And actually, three of the most prolific, the more public, most papers, the journals were actually not in English. So that's kind of important, as a lot of these systematic reviews, they tend to exclude non-English articles. And so when I looked at the author affiliations of all the papers, most author affiliation, 72 papers had at least one affiliation in China. And so they have a lot of not the cocoa production in Hainan Islands and other regions. And also I noticed India, Iran, Turkey, Brazil, Colombia. So maybe the BRICS as well. And so they have a lot of agro feedstocks. Maybe that's why. And also something that was discussed in the papers, why they like to work with this material is that it is high purity, tensile strength, biodegradable, and biocompatible. Biocompatible means that if you eat it, it's okay for your body, it's healthy. Or sometimes there's a lot of research with drug delivery, medicine with the same material. Also, it can be functionalized, shape control, and enhanced depending on how you treat it or what you add inside. Disadvantages that a lot of people talk about are the high production cost, and this can be due to the raw materials, energy consumption, or sterile conditions, as well as low yields. But that really depends on your optimization strategy. So, I guess in summary for this paper, there's a lot of disciplines, but they kind of work separately. There's not so much collaboration mixing them together. And also, there is geographic diversity. China leads in production focused research, while in Europe, we often see that they use the material, but for an application, such as material science experiment or biomedical. And so, for scalability, overcoming the production cost and efficiency compared to the cheaper materials is key to see a wider spread in application. And so in the next paper I'll share, it was looking at the same data set, but all of the fermentation conditions and seeing what waste is most common and which ones work better. So 96% use the same genus. It used to be Acetobacter, Glucanocetobacter, but now the current name is Kamagatibacter. So we can see that the same bacteria are used over and over consistently in the literature. And while we counted 299 different alternative ingredients, 71% that are used for bacterial cellulose production come from food industry, mainly the food waste. Other areas that I thought were interesting were biodiesel, bioenergy, tobacco, soap was used, or soap waste, pulp and paper, even textile waste was used to try to grow bacterial cellulose. But they noticed that maybe they need to do some pre-treatment on the textiles so that the chemicals from the dyeing process and so on don't inhibit the growth of the material and the bacteria. And so when we grow bacterial cellulose, there's mainly two forms. First is static. You will feed the ingredients to your organisms and keep it stable, let it grow in time. And that creates the pellicle-like shape that takes the area of your container. So if your container is a circle, it will grow in the circle shape. If it's a square, it will also grow in a square. However, there's also another common form, agitated. And so this means that in the incubator, they are constantly moving, and that creates a pellet like little circle fibrils. And so, depending on what industry you work in or what your application is, you may prefer one or the other. However, for the alternative waste, using almost maybe 90% of the papers conducted the static fermentation. And this one is actually the best one for fashion because it creates the bigger material volume that you need. And so before I get into the next paper, we talked about different disciplines and we talk about the material and how many people are starting to look at it. But one thing I was very curious about is that what can I learn about this material outside of the lab, just talking to people? And I wondered, are scientists and engineers and designers, all these disciplines, are they looking for the same things? And also, how do they approach collaborating with these organisms or technology? So I did my data collection was 20 interviews, and 10 were affiliated with the sciences, and 10 were in design, as you can see with the colors. And what I found is that there is a kind of spectrum of our relationship with the material and the organisms that grow them. So science is mainly utilitarian on the left, respectful coexistence, collaborative partnership, whereas in design, they were very much in the last two, empathetic connection and holistic integration. And so utilitarian is more of the functionality at all cost. So one of the participants mentioned when I asked him some questions that as much as I love the microbes and want to give them a smiley face, they're just algorithm of evolution. And that's it. I don't think about them too much. I just appreciate what they do. And so that's similar to respectful coexistence, but here they acknowledge a bit more the role that these microbes play in their process, but they're still tied to the functionality. In the collaborative partnership, there's a deeper acknowledgement. Without the microbes, without these technologies, we cannot develop the materials. And so one of the participants mentioned that their students, when they work with them, it's like almost like they have a pet. They have to feed them, they have to take care of them. If they get sick, they will notice in the lab because the coloration might change or they may smell something different with the fermentation. And so it's a constant process of us and them working together. Now, when we look at empathetic connection and holistic integration, this was mainly designers. And I would say this is possibly because of the more than human movement. But here, it's not just about recognizing what they do, but thinking about how we can best respect them as an equal partner. And so, for instance, one of the participants, designers, mentioned I sing to them, I nurture them, I take care of them. I wouldn't do anything to myself that I wouldn't do to them. And another one mentioned that once I gave some kombucha SCOBY to my colleague and they just let it dry on their desk. And I felt really hurt by that, seeing it shrivel up and sort of decay in my eyes. And then this participant, did an art piece based on that experience. So as you can see from those examples, scientists and designers, they treat the materials differently. They have different perspectives of working with the microbes, and that also creates challenges when we're trying to work together. Because if I'm more on the right side and thinking holistically of the microbes, and I'm talking to the scientists, they're not going to understand me at all, and vice versa, because they're taught to think in a certain way. And now, moving on to the next themes of the paper, I noticed that there was some public perception challenges in the sense that when you say it's grown from bacteria, there can be like an ill factor from the consumers. And so we may have to shift the narrative and find ways to make it more acceptable. For instance, some participants mentioned probiotics, kombucha. Bacteria are good for you. They're in your body. You have healthy bacteria. It's not bad. And so we have to think a bit on that marketing strategy, I guess, for these new materials to get more consumer acceptance. And moving on to the third area, a key from science and design, they liked that it was a great material, raw material to program, to adapt. And so it can be adapted on multiple levels, genetically, chemically, environmentally. And so this iterative, experimental, interdisciplinary nature can push the boundaries of both material science and design. Now, I'll skip that slide. And just to conclude, the stakeholders, which I interviewed in academia and industry across design and science, we also, when we're developing these materials, think in different perspectives. And so we have to consider that in collaboration. And also, the programmability allows for advanced material modifications and future innovation in sustainable design. However, we still have to look at social cultural implications and address those public perceptions and ethical considerations. So now moving to the next study, now that we know science and design think differently and kind of the collaboration challenges, I looked at the same interview group, but I focused on the design group. And I asked them about their challenges entering the science part of fashion biotechnology. So these were people that they learned how to do lab work for the biomaterials that they're working with. And all of them agreed that collaboration is important, and they all sought a mentor from the science side as a designer, including myself. And so this is crucial for navigating that interdisciplinary field. Some participants sought expertise from microbiology, synthetic biology, chemistry, depending on who was around and who was willing to work with them. The types of experiences were mainly positive, resulting in great breakthroughs. However, some challenges arose because maybe sometimes the STEM side may have skepticism of the creative side or underestimate the potential of such collaboration together. And a key challenge in collaborating was the space and resource limitations. Because if you're in the fashion space and you're learning to work with these materials, you need a space that can provide basic tools. And so, one participant, when they were working in the lab, they had to bring their students there on the weekends or evenings or summer, because usually the faculty of science only has those type of spaces, and they're occupied for classes and other science faculty. So this is a challenge, and it's starting to change. So for instance, in the United Kingdom, Northumbria University, they actually have designers and scientists working in the same laboratories together, and they can help each other, as I'll mention later. And so the next theme that I found talking to the design participants was the differences in discipline. So, for instance, terminology, not just not knowing terms or practices, but sometimes our fields may have the same thing in different terminology, different words. So, you have to learn how to communicate and collaborate with each other. And also, the learning process was a challenge. Going from the theoretical understanding and the artisanal approach to trying stuff in a lab can be challenging. So, there is a need for mentorship and guidance in that, and also a lack of resources. When I say that, standardized guides and platforms that can make it more accessible to future researchers. And so, finally, while there were a lot of challenges, I also want to share a positive thing that I noticed. And that was that when designers were in the laboratory, participants in science and design said positive things about how they bring an extra sense of creativity, vision, sustainability goals to the lab. They actually challenged and pushed some scientific research groups to develop more findings, innovative techniques. So one participant said, if it was just a science group, we may think of just the publication and paper and the figure, but working with designers, they don't care about the figure. They want to make a bigger material. They want to see a real world impact, and they present things in different ways. So we have that allows us to increase our output and outreach. However, sometimes when designers entered those spaces, it was hard to negotiate their identity. Am I a scientist? Am I a designer? That's also something I experienced, but I'll share more about that later. So, in summary, collaborative integration. We're seeing more of this design and science collaboration in universities across the world. However, there are learning and terminology gaps that need to be bridged. And what I see in the future is that the laboratory will be an important future fashion classroom. In the US, a lot of fashion programs took away those textile science components or, focus more on the design. But now with biodesign, I think it's going to come back. And with that, we will have to consider mentorship, dedicated physical spaces, and that allow future research across science and design to work together. And so my last bacterial cellulose paper I want to share is about my time in China when I was 6 months in the chemistry lab. I've never had a formal background in chemistry, but I realized for what I wanted to do, I needed to find a place. And so, some of the tips that I can share with you, and so these were some of the materials. I guess I'll share about the project first before I share about what I learned in the process. So I was particularly focused on the natural dyes. I used two natural dyes, which are also traditional Chinese medicine. I used safflower, which gave me an orange color, and I also used lithospermum, which gave me a purple. So those were the two dyes. And for mordants, I used chitosan and potassium aluminum sulfate. And so the goal was to try different practices in the lab and see how I can improve the color because without the mordants, sometimes it colors unevenly. And so in this 6 month process, I learned that there is so much physicality and building muscle memory. And at first, I was accidentally spilling liquids when I was purifying them or staining my gloves or I dropped glassware. But over time, once you get into the pattern, it becomes second nature to you. And so, but in that process, the experiments can often take a long time. So for instance, I would extract the dyes, that's 1 hour, and then I need to filter them, which can take a lot more time. And then I need to dye the material, which I would do 3 hours and so on. And so all of those things add up time over multiple days or periods, and you need to plan it efficiently. At first, I was skipping this planning process, and then that would lead to errors or I wouldn't eat and then I would make mistakes later. So in this process, scientific work for designers, it takes a lot, but you have to plan it efficiently and then also I would say adapt to the lab culture. So their science supervisors are typically busy, and so if they have a lab group, you're going to rely more on the students rather than the supervisor, which was new to me. Coming from design, I mainly just only spoke to my supervisor in Australia, and so I had to adapt to that process. And so there was things like every week they clean the lab, there are safety protocols, that different things you have to adhere to, and that process of adapting really helps me with a successful project. And so I can share some of the things that I learned in this process. Drying it with different containers, I noticed that I would get different thicknesses for the same time in the same drying conditions. Also, a designer in the laboratory, it allowed me to explore a lot more with the with the materials than I ever had before. And so I'll play this video. This was made by a mistake, but I made a bacterial cellulose foam rather than a textile. And it was um very sturdy, very durable. And so in the process of freeze drying my samples to test them later. You're supposed to freeze them first, right? But I forgot to do that and I just stuck them in the freeze dryer. And at first I was worried, but I asked my colleague, "Is this going to be a problem?" They said no. And right away I noticed this very interesting effect. So rather than taking it out, I just kept it there. And then it turned into a foam. And so also when you're in the lab, ideally scientists they want to test and understand how things work at the molecular chemical levels, and so this actually involves you to break down your materials again. I never deconstructed bacterial cellulose, but for one testing analysis I have to make a powder, and then I it was like a confetti, when you're working with packaging and you have those little pieces of paper, right? And so that was a new form of bacterial cellulose I had never experienced, but working with them and getting them tested uh, to see how well the coloration is holding up, that really provided a new process. And also here, it was like a slurry. Before I froze them, I had blended them. So that created very interesting results. And so, what I'll share from the science side, I also got to learn a bit about material characterization. And so, I'll just briefly touch on that. So, in the first two images, A and B, we have the scanning electron microscopy. And here, what this does, sometimes you see with your visual eye, but when you see on the microscope 10,000 times magnification, you can really get to the fibro level and see the changes that are happening. So here is the never dyed, never mordanted. But on the right side, I used the purple dye, right? Lithospermum. And what we can see, at first I thought it was a mistake, but then they explained to me, this is the coating of your dye on the fibers, on the material, right? But we can see that it's a bit uneven. You can see some fibers in some points, and maybe some other points the coating is quite heavy. And that's where I realized with the mordants, with the other images, that the mordants helped bind it more consistently. However, if I see all the purple ones with my eye, I'm not going to notice those changes. Same with the safflower and orange. And so the next graph here I want to share is about FTIR, the spectroscopy. And so this uses waves or a light source to shine on the material, and then you kind of find different peaks bonding. And so this, the bottom graph spectra, is from the no, not colored, not dyed one. You can see there's very big peaks like mountains, right? And that shows there's a lot of potential for bonding, whereas in the top one, a lot of those bondings are not available anymore, I guess you can say. And that was because the dye binded to the material. So we're seeing that happen in action. And we can see that in the hydroxyl, the carbonyl, and fingerprint regions. So this is showing us molecular changes that are happening based on the design processes that we're doing. And then the final one, we use X-ray diffraction. So this has characteristic cellulose peaks. So it's showing us that, yeah, this is cellulose. But what we can see here as well, depending on how you modify, is that how these graphs show us the crystallinity of the material, and that also shows us the material strength and durability. So all of these processes that I'm learning to work with help us design better materials. And so I guess I can conclude with just that section, in that as designers, it's up to us to bridge the gaps of design and science. And I wanted to highlight the growing importance of using the laboratory, of using scientific methods for biodesign and for design. And so, what that empowers designers is that we can make better materials and make informed, sustainable decisions. And also, I wanted to share that I see this growing more often, but a hybrid role, I would say, of designer scientist, which is what I call myself. I'm not a designer only, I'm not a full scientist. I'm somewhere in the middle, and I try to absorb both methods. And so, now that we've talked a lot about bacterial cellulose and given many examples of how to work with the material, I want to talk a bit about sea urchin waste. And this project is still in the developing stages, not as much as my first one, but um, sea urchins are causing a big problem in the Oceania region. They are growing too fast as a population. And the problem with that is that when sea urchins uh, increase in population, they are actually also destroying the kelp forests and coral reefs, which is creating underground barrens, like a desert underwater. This also is starting to affect other aquatic life that are typically using those areas to thrive. And now there's nothing there. With the sea urchin, 10% of the sea urchin may be used for food industry if it's edible, but 90% is waste. So a lot of people are not incentivized to grab the overpopulated sea urchins. And so, but when we look at the waste, there's a lot of valuable resources that could be utilized. So there is chitin, chitosan as carbohydrates, and these are used in the medical industry or textiles to provide antibacterial finishes, right? Or to blend into the textiles. There's also collagen and gelatin. There's a lot of calcium carbonate, and this can be used as mineral supplements depending on the quality, or it can be used as for biocement. And what I'm most interested in, there are amazing bioactive compounds that are good for medicinal purposes, such as anti-cardiotoxic, it can protect your heart, fungicide, anti-inflammatory, anti-diabetic, which have been researched out there. Um, and the interesting thing is that they're also colorful. So they can possibly be used for the textile industry. So 1,000 sea urchins can create 20 kilos of sea urchin powder. And I want to show you the next photo. Rather than sending them to landfill, the sea urchin divers have just put them in a backyard somewhere here. And these are all the shells. And because they said it's too expensive to send to the landfill. So this is a waste valuable resource that is just sitting there in the ocean and not being utilized enough in Australia. And so far, I'm working with the collaborative team, scientists, community members, the divers themselves. And so the hardest part of what I want to share in this project is that it's not just working with the material, it's creating the process to bring them there to test. And that took a while. Material transfer agreements, agreeing, understanding each other, what the fishermen gain from us working together. And so when they gave us the sea urchins, you can see the purple ones and the orange ones, we had to learn how to get them to a form we can work with. And so they were wet, we have to dry them. And I heard in the lab they were very, very smelly. So some people didn't like the sea urchins in that space. So we use a ball mill to grind them up into powder. But if we didn't dry them enough carefully, they turn into this very interesting paste. And so in this project, I can share that we've been working on extracting some of those pigments that were medicinally interesting as well as fashion interesting. And we're also going to try to test them in different areas, but that hasn't necessarily started yet. And so we're also working with an artist, a designer, and this has been so important for us to visualize, to get a preliminary testing outside the lab in an easier form. She worked with the sea urchins and she got this was canvas fabric. And this is a very beautiful pink that was just done artisanally. So then we can see that, okay, this actually has potential interest. And now we can do more in the lab or with a collaborative partner. And so in this project, also, one of the important things that I'm working on is a framework or a manual because we had so many challenges coming together to develop the sea urchin waste into new technology. We want to make a guide for other people, other stakeholders around the world so that they can use their own waste and have an easier time than we did. So that is all for my presentation. I can acknowledge different universities and people and my cute Chihuahua dog with my parents. I like to put his picture there in the middle. His name is Baby. And if you want to contact me, you can add me on LinkedIn or send me an email. And um, in case you have any questions, you can share them on Zoom, or if this slide works, you can ask your questions on the menti.com and I can answer them here. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Uh, that is most fascinating, no? Bridging science and design to fashion. Um, I learned a lot from your discussion. Okay, so we have questions from the audience. You can type in at the Mentimeter from Luis, or you can also type that out in our Q&A in the Zoom. Okay, we have a comment from Ma'am Gay Jalsita. Hello, Ma'am Gay. So I think this is a comment. Nata de Coco. So she says something, the Cocoa Patch solution for severe burns is another product manufactured by a Japanese company. which won a prize from the Design
Mhm.
Center of the Philippines. It is marketed in a foil pack. Do you have comments on this?
Yes, it's a very common in wound healing. Actually, I visited a group in Germany earlier this year, and they work on the pharmacy medical side, and so they're testing it in-house. And one of the reasons is because it can provide like a barrier for infection to happen, but also it has in the wet form, it can be very have a lot of water or liquid inside, so it can provide medicine or solutions there for that wound healing process. And so yes, it definitely is used for that absorption quality, and it's not just used there, but also in Europe and around the world in some
Mhm.
hospitals and places. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. I have several questions. So, in your statistics, you said that there is about 69%, no, in the global textiles have been
Mhm.
put into waste, and in the next 4 years, according to the climate meter, we need to do
Right.
we need to act soon and all. No, my question is, up to what extent does this kind of projects or even the
Mm,
consciousness at this time is or has been for, let's say, not only in the fashion industry but also for the local folks that you have, in conversation with and others.
right. So I guess can you repeat like you're asking like how
Up
does that
to what
affect the
extent?
local
Yeah.
communities, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I guess when I think of the Philippines and when I visited, I know there was so much cultural heritage and textile knowledge. And so, one thing I can share is that even some research groups are starting to practice knitting and seeing how these materials can be manufactured in that sense. And maybe there's ways of using new materials in historical process. Like I would find that fusion to be interesting. Um, and I think regarding the climate clock and that we need to act soon, I think that these provide a potential solution, but I also want to repeat that they're not the only one. I think
Mm.
also it comes to individual consumers realizing we need to consume less, and also policy from government to say that, some countries they used to export the textile waste in Africa, and some African countries are saying we're not going to take it anymore. And so they're having to find the alternative solutions. And so it's not just the research side, but it's societal, consumers, community, government. I guess when things get worse, they will act more in that regard.
Yeah, how would you translate your study to a local weaver, for instance, in the Philippines? Like for instance, the Corditex is working with Northern Luzon weavers, and your method and approach is really something wonderful, no, for the industry. But to a local weaver, for instance, how will you explain this? And probably it's difficult to shift, right? Because uh, uh, the problem in the Philippines, there's scarcity of cotton. We're still working on that. And now this alternative that you're proposing, how can we, explain or to a local weaver this your study?
Right. I guess I can say that these new materials, I don't think they like they have the potential to be new materials that the weavers can utilize in their designs, and that if they're able to get that experience in the future, they could have more opportunities with international companies that are really wanting these new materials. They just haven't seen the prototypes and the developments. And so a lot of the big brands they want these materials, but the startups developing them have a harder time to get them made in the way that the companies want. So maybe collaborating with the local weavers, with the community, the knowledge there can help them address the startups' problems, if that makes sense, and open markets in the Philippines for these materials, kind of like how Pinatex they have been working with the farmers for the pineapple leaf fiber, and that is opening up opportunities all around the world and growing in popularity. I kind of see maybe the farmers might have more opportunity in that regard if they have the food waste or agriculture waste.
In terms of limitations, and of course challenges in your own research, have you encountered some of these problems or issues, limitations and challenges?
Like the challenges that I was mentioning in the presentation, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I personally had those problems. I have interacted with science faculty that didn't believe that I could learn anything or do it in the beginning in my undergrad. And then I did my PhD and I collaborated and I got it done. And I also sometimes the terminology I learned when I went to the pharmacy group to visit. I talk textile dyeing and mordants, and they use loading techniques and absorption for nearly the same thing. So I kind of had to learn how to, what are the words you're using? How do we talk to each other? And I think what helped me understand a bit more when I did the paper on designer and scientist and the spectrum with materials, that really helped me understand the differences. So now I know how to talk to different people or understand their perspectives more. Um, Also, the challenge of the physical space that's a real challenge because it's hard for me, even though I have some science background now, it's hard for me to find the right laboratories or training or places that are willing to host such research
Mm-hmm.
and genuinely provide support on both sides, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Luis. We have a question from our one of our participants, and he or she's asking, do you think this biocellulose can also be used as absorption materials like those used in diapers?
Mm, Possibly, but I think it would need some revisions. So when it's wet and a thick pellicle, it has a lot of liquid there. But when it's dry, if you fully dry it, you cannot get it back into like a absorption wet pellicle state. However, I know some laboratory groups they're making it environmentally responsive, that it can go from one form to another in the lab. So maybe it can. Um, I also know that they're commercially used for face masks because they're hydrating. So, and they're also used for wastewater remediation to absorb things. So there are applications. I just haven't. I'm not sure if it's been done for diapers yet, but that could be an interesting area to look at. Um,
Yeah. This biocellulose have antibacterial properties as well. The Corditex team have also tested cotton, which has some antibacterial properties when woven. Do you think it's the same? Do they have some components?
I think that not naturally, but you can easily add into it those properties. And so I just noticed the next question I can tag along about the small producers communities. Does it have to be large factories? I
Mm-hmm.
don't think so because I think when you look at, especially in Southeast Asia, you have huge nata de coco production, right? And so you can already rely on what's there, possibly depending on what industry you're going to. And you may not need the big volumes to start off right away. It depends what you want to make, but there's already concentration of production sites in the Philippines, I would say, and around that you could activate. Um, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Ray, for that question. Okay. Do you have,
Oh,
yeah.
I just wanted to add the small producers and communities. You also don't have to work with 100% biocellulose
Mm,
because maybe there are some cheaper items, right? So some research groups have tried adding 2%, 3%, 4% into cotton or other textiles, and they found that that adds extra strength. It helps as a composite material. So you can also use a small amount in fashion in different items, and that could possibly be more effective. So
Okay. Luis, this is something I would like to ask you, like your mission now for this research. Will you take this on after doing or finishing or continuing this research? What's the next
right,
step for you? Because it's the future design, no? Yeah.
right. So, I just applied for the Humboldt postdoc fellowship in Germany.
Mhm.
So hopefully, if everything goes well, I may be there. And my goal is like in the next few years, I want to learn more from the sciences so that I can come back and train and help mentor other researchers that want to use design and science to create new materials, not just bacterial cellulose, but depending on where I am, I want to look at the communities in those regions. Like, for instance, I was working with sea urchin waste because that's a problem in Australia. And the regional town, the sea urchin divers are in a town of 1,000 people. And they came to me and we talk about it. So, I want to train other people in the future that's, whether they're in the Philippines or the US or Australia, that they can learn how to develop these things and try new processes for sustainable future. And I want to work a lot with industry collaborators, not just big companies, but farmers and weavers and community-based initiatives as well. Hopefully that helps answer.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you visited the Philippines and you have seen the pineapple production and fiber. Aside from the pineapple fiber, have you seen other potential alternative materials, no, for weaving, aside, of course, from cotton, abaca, and piña, and all?
I didn't get to like explore too much then, but I know there's a lot of regional fruits that I found interesting at that time that maybe like the skins of them could be used or different byproducts. So I think there's a lot in the farming that could be used there that's specific to the Philippines. I just haven't had the time to try it out myself or explore those materials.
Should visit us again to explore more.
Yes, sure.
Okay,
I would
so
love to see whether bacterial cellulose could be used in the weaving because I don't think that has been done before or tested. Like all these biomaterials, they're grown in the mat sheets, but now people are learning how to make them in yarns. And
mhm,
so maybe that is a way that the weavers could collaborate and the companies want something like that, big brands, luxury brands, and so that could be a potential thing to talk about in the future. Yeah.
okay, thank you very much. So I think we have answered all the questions already. We thank our audience. Any last words to our very enthusiastic audience around the world? They have been here listening to you. Any last words and to encourage also other scientists out there who are listening?
Right. Well, if you ever have any questions, don't you can feel free to email me or message me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to help answer because, in this path, I also had a lot of mentors and people I had to rely on. If you want to work with things like this, there's not a manual out there or a perfect instructional guide, but you just keep pushing forward and these fields are changing. So maybe a few years from now, like there are already master programs in biodesign in the UK and initiatives that are popping up around the world. And um, yeah, this is a potential solution, but there are so many other solutions. So um, yeah, I hope we can all work together for a more sustainable future. Oh, and to answer this last question, I didn't see it earlier. Will it ever become mainstream? I think it will, but I think it still needs time. But things are changing fast. There are a lot of companies embracing these materials, but it's a lot of development involved in that process.
Yes, and of course, the laboratories and spaces for collaboration are also important. The connections and relationships that should be built, no, towards the goal that you propose.
Right.
So that's very important. Okay, we thank our audience, and we thank Luis for spending some time with us for the Corditex webinar. Uh, what time is it there in Australia? Are you in the Australia?
Um, I was, but I'm in the US now this
Okay.
year, my home country, 10:13 p.m., but it's okay. It's not too late, thankfully.
Thank you, Luis, for taking time and sharing your knowledge about this new technology on biotextiles. No, I think that this is something that is very useful for the industry, especially with the alarming state of waste and climate change and everything happening around us. So, thank you very much. So, just to remind our friends that the Corditex have a website. You can also listen to our previous webinars. If you miss them, you can actually find them here. So we have a website. So hopefully we seek permission from Luis to upload his webinar here. If you miss the webinars,
Feel free to.
they are uploaded in this website. Thank you, Luis. So we'll add Luis's webinar here. So you can check out the Corditex website. We have important resource of information useful for study and research. We also have an active Facebook page. You can also check our activities and events uh, uh, of the Corditex. No? So thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Luis. So hopefully we see you in the Philippines for another maybe future talk or activity with the Corditex. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good night and
Take
thank
care
you.
then.
Okay, bye bye. Thank you.